Hello, everyone. Welcome to Professor Laurie Bauer's lecture at Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online. My name is Camila Ulrich. I'm a PhD student at Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and I'll be moderating this conference today. First of all, I would like to thank the president of Abralim, Professor Miguel Oliveira Jr., and the vice president, Professor Raquel Freitag, for organizing this amazing event. And also, I would like to thank Professor Laurie Bauer for accepting the invitation to talk to us and to collaborate with this project. Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online is an initiative from the Brazilian Association of Linguistics in cooperation with other international associations, the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, the Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, the Sociedad Española de Lingüística, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Societas Lingüística Europea, the Australian Linguistics Society, the International Association of Applied Linguistics, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. Today, Professor Laurie Bauer's lecture is named "What is the Plural of Mouse and Other Unhelpful Questions for Morphologists?" Professor Bauer is Emeritus Professor of Linguistics in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. His main interests are morphology, in particular in word formation, and different varieties of English language, in special English spoken in New Zealand. He is the author of over 20 books, including English Word Formation, Introducing Linguistic Morphology, and Morphological Productivity. His book, The Oxford Reference Guide to English Morphology, won the LSA's Leonard Bloomfield Prize, and in 2017, he was awarded the Royal Society of New Zealand's Humanities Medal. So now let's enjoy Professor Bauer's lecture. In the end of his talk, we'll have some minutes for questions, so you can write your questions in English or in Portuguese on the chat. And again, thank you, Professor Bauer, for being with us in this lecture tonight.
Thank you for that nice introduction. Hello, I'm Laurie Bauer, talking to you from New Zealand, Wellington, New Zealand, in the middle of winter. The middle of winter in 42 degrees south means that the maximum temperature for the day is forecast to be 10 degrees Celsius, and that's fairly typical for this time of year. The maximum temperature in the middle of summer would be somewhere around about 25 degrees Celsius. So you see, we work on a very narrow range of temperatures. 42 degrees south in Northern Hemisphere terms corresponds to Sapporo, Beijing, Ankara, Rome, Barcelona, Boston, Eugene, Oregon. So, but of course we have an oceanic climate. The other thing to tell you about New Zealand, I suppose, at the moment is that in the entire country we have fewer than 30 cases of COVID virus in the community. And all of those people are people who have come in fairly recently. Okay, that's got nothing to do with what we're going to be talking about today, though. As Camilla said, I think I'm probably best known as a morphologist, and I'm certainly going to be talking as a morphologist today, although I hope that you will discover that what I have to say applies to more than just morphology and more than just morphologists. So the aims of the paper are, first of all, to show that in asking questions of morphologists, we make theoretical assumptions about languages which may not be justified. And you can, of course, replace morphologists with phonologists or syntacticians or semanticists and so on. I also want to challenge some of the assumptions that are quite widely made about about morphology and by morphologists. And I'm going to do this by asking half a dozen or so questions, some of which are related to each other, so that there's going to be a certain amount of overlap in the kinds of answers that I give. Okay, so we start off with these cute little people. Well, cute as long as they're not living in your kitchen. And we say, what is the plural of mouse? And if you look at these things, you're going to look at me and say, well, it's obvious, they're mice. Fine. But what are these things called? Whether you're a native speaker of English or a non-native speaker of English, I guess you do a sort of slight hesitation before responding to this particular question. Are they mice or are they mouses? And if I ask you what these are, well, then you get really unhappy about trying to answer. My students tend to think that these are Mickey Mouses, but I'll have something to say about how representative that is in just a moment. But I don't know whether you're old enough to remember the cartoon about Mr. Jinx and Pixie and Dixie. Mr. Jinx was famous for talking about the mouses. Well, he actually said on a regular basis, I hate those mices to pieces. So, oops, I'm going backwards there for some reason. The word mouse does not have a single plural form. There are at least 3 in general use, and I'm not going to rule out the idea that there may be others. In fact, when this lecture was first presented in my own institution and the title was put up on a notice board, somebody came along and very kindly answered the question, what is the plural of mouse? With the answer, mices. Not all of these forms are equally likely, but even in context, we cannot predict absolutely which one will occur. Let's look at some textual examples. Here's one. I've never seen so many Daffy Ducks and Mickey Mouses in one place. Okay, so that fits with what my students think. One specialized in dreadful plastic kitsch, another toys, 10,000 Mickey Mice. So there's variation in whether it's Mickey Mouses or Mickey Mice in textual examples. And even the most unlikely nouns can have more than one plural. There's a wonderful Peanuts cartoon in which Linus is going to school and suddenly discovers that he's left something at home because they're going to study iggly at school. When Charlie Brown asks him what iggly are, Linus says, it's a plural. 1 igloo, 2 iggly. I know that with so many etymologists, morphologists, language historians watching, you're going to have lots of good reasons why the plural iggly of igloo is totally impossible in English. And of course, it's meant as a joke, but even jokes are part of the language, even if they're not a high frequency part of the language. But there are other words with multiple plurals in English. A box as a piece of Unix hardware has the plural boxen. Nobody knows what the plural of criterion or criterion, whether criterion's even the singular. Criteria, criterias, criterions, nobody knows. Words borrowed from Hebrew like goy, kibbutz, and Ashkenazi, can have Hebrew plurals or can have English plurals. And of course, you could illustrate similar phenomena from phenomena from other languages. Octopuses, octopodes, octopi. Strangely, Word, I think, seems to prefer octopi, which I think is a piece of bad etymology, if not bad English. And a whole bunch of words like runner-up, where there's variation between runners-up, which is what is normatively prescribed, and runner-ups. And with the word text, at least in those parts of the English-speaking world where text is the normal word for an SMS message, we get variable plural forms like texes and things like that. So my overall conclusion from that set of data is that the forms which fill paradigm slots are not necessarily unique, and that a grammar which provides a unique form is likely to be insufficient. So asking what is the plural of mouse is the wrong question to ask. What we should be asking is, what are the potential plurals of mouse? This general point has been argued by Anna Thornton under the label of overabundance, and she uses Italian data, which is far more interesting and far more varied than the rather limited English data that I've given. But similar phenomena have been found in a whole host of other languages as well. So English is not rich in these particular examples, but other languages are. Okay, that's my first question. Here's my second one. What are the rules for regular inflection in otherwise irregularly inflected forms? So given that something you perhaps expected plural of mouse is mice, when are you going to get mouses? How do we know when to say mouses rather than mice? And the literature is full of clues. Names are said to be regularly inflected, and that gives you the Mickey Mouse's bit, but we've seen that that doesn't happen all the time. Exocentric compounds are said to be regularly inflected, so we say saber-tooths rather than saber-teeth. And non-literals, metaphorical cases, are said to be regularly inflected, so we get computer mouses rather than computer mice. Well, what does the evidence say? We've already seen some of the evidence on Mickey Mouse and Mickey Mouses or Mickey Mice, but here's what Google Ngrams has, where you see that there's amazing amount of variation. Mickey Mouse is at the moment just ahead of Mickey Mice, post 2000. But the two rather more balanced than I had expected, given my experience with my own students and indeed my own intuitions. The example that everybody cites of the names getting it wrong, or perhaps exocentric compounds being regular, is the Toronto maple leafs, when you would expect the plural of leaf to be leaves, but it's maple leaves. But another sports team is the Minnesota Timberwolves, which is inflected in precisely the same way as wolves is. So again, you can't actually guarantee what kind of form you're going to find. And if we look at what happens with computer mouses versus computer mice, there again, we've got Ngram data. If you look very early in the piece when these things started appearing, and this is the blown up bit right down at the bottom of the chart, computer mouses was far more common, but from about 1981 onwards, computer mice takes off, and computer mice is now the more common of the two collocations. If we look at corpus data, here from the corpus of contemporary American English, the grotesquely fertile soil that sends up grasses and broad leaves, so inflected just as leaves is, through the quartz surface, irregular form. The forest of emerald evergreens and golden broadleafs, regular inflection for precisely the same word the same lexeme that we had before. So again, variation in whether we get the irregular inflection in the exocentric compound, or whether we get the regular inflection in the exocentric compound. And I don't understand what this one particular expression means. It's not part of my English, but our gooses were constantly getting bumped is what it comes up in Coca. And whereas you also get in Coca, the anti-tobacco politicos had cooked their geese with the expected irregular inflection. So again, even in non-literal cases, we get both regular and irregular inflection coming up. So what I conclude here, therefore, is that the locations for regular versus irregular exponents of morphological categories are not necessarily predictable on a lexical basis, and indeed not necessarily predictable on those generalized bases that you find in the literature on these things. There are preferences, there are tendencies. Some of these are much preferred over others, but it's hard to say that there are rules. Okay, next question. Sorry, I turn over my pages so I can catch up. What is the word for not adjective? Now, clearly this is a specific version of a more general question. The implication is that there's a unique output for any given semantic or onomasiological input. So if you want to know what the negative of a particular adjective is, the expectation is in certain quarters that there should be an answer to that we should know what the answer is, and there should just be one. Negative adjectives seem particularly prone to variation, but there's variation in a whole lot of places. Think, for instance, of possible nominalizations of the verb commit. So you can have commission, you can have committal, you can have commissure, you can have commitment. And they all mean slightly different things, but they're all, they all can mean slightly different things, and their preferred readings are slightly different, but nonetheless they can overlap in meaning. And so there is not just one output for the category of nominalization of a particular verb. Okay, so let's look at what the OED tells us for the negative of particular adjectives. The Oxford English Dictionary, well known, of course, for collecting as much as it possibly can, but nonetheless, it has both ahistorical and unhistorical, which is interesting for students of Greek, but it also has unhistorical. It says you can have allogical, illogical, or unlogical. It says you can have atypical or untypical, and all the others in between. In other words, for a whole lot of adjectives, the Oxford English Dictionary does not give us a single answer. It gives us a range of potential answers. And some of these are much more common than others. I would guess that impolite is much more common than unpolite, for instance. Nonetheless, the variation exists. If we look at corpus data, here's a whole bunch of words from, I think all taken from Coca. The ones with an O in brackets following them appear also in the Oxford English Dictionary, so they're not just Coca inventions, they're not just off the top of somebody's head forms. All of these are using the in, I think all of them are using the in prefix. In all of these cases, I think the un prefix would be expected, would be more common, but we find variation. So as with the inflectional cases that I talked about earlier, the exponents of derivational categories are not necessarily predictable on a lexical basis. You don't get single answers to these questions. Let's change our focus and look at allomorphy. Part of the definition of an allomorph, or a set of allomorphs, is that they're in complementary distribution. And that distribution may be conditioned phonologically or lexically or in some other way. Even if you accept that point, everybody seems to agree that the nicest allomorphs, the ones which are most easily dealt with and perhaps are most prototypical cases of allomorphs, are the ones that are phonologically conditioned. And some linguists use the term allomorphy only when the forms are phonologically conditioned and not when they are lexically conditioned or conditioned in some other way. So let's look at some examples. And the first example I want to take is the English prefix en, which has an allomorph em, which generally occurs before bilabial consonants, and you get en everywhere else, the elsewhere form. So the expected forms, which you find, are things like embark, to get onto a ship, emplane, to get onto a plane, entrain, to get onto a train, amongst other meanings, where the em form, or the bilabial nasal, occurs before a bilabial consonant, and the en is the elsewhere form. Again, if we look at corpus evidence, or indeed in some cases not even corpus evidence, just look at any dictionary that you want to pick up, we find a slightly different story with more variation allowed for. So virtually any dictionary that you mentioned, the G stands for general there, will give you enmesh as the form of that verb rather than emmesh. Some of them will give you emmesh as an alternative, but enmesh is the one that is given as the basic form of that word. But enmired is from Coca, enmagicked from Coca, enplane not only from Coca but from the BNCs. So this is not just an individual having a funny turn and not knowing what to say. There is some generalization to this. Enpool from Coca and enpued from Coca. In other words, of course, our rule of allomorphy is failing. If we look at the negative suffix in, then we get im before a bilabial. I've set this out here in terms of the orthography. IM before a bilabial, IR before an R, IL before an L, and IN as the elsewhere variant. We could reformulate that in phonetic terms in rather more detailed way. but what we get there is sufficient for us to make the point. So the expected forms are things like improbable, irreparable, illegitimate, and inevitable. IM before a bilabial, IR before an R, IL before an L, and IN in the default cases. And again, if we look at what actually happens in the corpus data, we find forms like imbalance, invariable, unbelievable, imperfections, impracticable, all from Coker, and impronunciable, no longer current, from the Oxford English Dictionary. This particular set of data is rather less robust than the others examples that I've given you, because if you think of your computer keyboard, N is adjacent to M and I is adjacent to U. So there are two different routes through which these could be typographical errors. Nonetheless, the fact that you get them relatively frequently suggests that there is something more going on than just having a single right answer. So the exponents of derivational, as well as inflectional categories, are not necessarily predictable on a phonological basis. Allomorphic patterns are not immutable. And again, the question therefore has to be reformulated. It's not when do we get which allomorphs, it's when do we most get which allomorphs most of the time. My fifth question, I seem to be getting through these at the rate of knots today, is about productivity. Productivity is not something that phonologists and syntacticians seem to worry about a great deal, although there are notable exceptions. But it is a question that has worried morphologists for more than 30 years anyway, probably more than 50 years. Some affixes seem to be used far more than others, and sometimes they're in competition, as ness and itia, and we seem to end up with what we want to know, why they're in competition, why we get one more than the other, what it is that causes this, and what the limitations are. Since, as I said, I'm acting as a morphologist, I'm going to answer this in morphological terms. I actually think that there are useful, that the notion would be useful for phonologists and syntacticians as well, but I shan't be going into that in any way today. So again, question 5 is a specific case of a more general question. And the more general question is, can we compare the productivity of two affixes? And I want to start off here again by looking at the Coker data. A warning about Coker data here, though, and that is that by definition, any corpus data gives you examples of words which already exist in the community in some sense or another. It's very difficult, might be impossible, to find Coker data, or sorry, more generally corpus data, which only gives you creative uses of the affixes. So with that warning, we find different places where ity is preferred, and places where ness is preferred. So if you've got something that ends in the suffix al, then we get more than 1,000 cases of ality, but we only get 91 cases of alness. So ality is clearly preferred in that particular case. But if you add ant, if you're adding it to something that ends in ant, you get antness rather than antity, which only exists in quantity, which is hardly a relevant case anyway. If you look at these particular examples more closely, this is not simply a matter of whether we've got a single cross boundary or a double cross boundary, whether we've got a level 1 affix or a level 2 affix preceding. There is variation which is independent of any generalization that I can see. That's not to say that there isn't, that there aren't generalizations here. And below that blank line that's near the bottom of the display there, we've got cases where the preference is far less clear cut, and so the numbers are far closer together. The moral of this particular set of data is that it's not the case that affixes are productive or unproductive, or at least it's not only that affixes are productive or unproductive. They're productive or not productive in particular domains. The productivity of an affix is only some kind of overall average. And in any kind of overall average, you must be losing information. And the information that you get for the average is far less informative than the answer for individual domains. This is not a new observation. Mark Aronoff talks about this way back in 1976. So people have known this for a long time, but still we talk about the productivity of an affix. And it seems to me that actually it's an open question as to whether the total forms found are more important than the number of domains found, or how you should weigh domains and total forms. If you get one domain which has a whole lot of forms but no other domain that has that, how do you balance these out? How do you measure productivity in that kind of situation? And that kind of situation is typical. If we go further and think about the suffix, the er that we get in diner, in the North American sense, that is a place where you dine, as opposed to the person who does the dining. So I'm talking about a locative er there. There are a handful of cases of locative er in English, but it has, at least historically, and I suspect going forward, been far less productive than the agentive er that you get in a word like killer. Both are usually seen as the same suffix, so that the domains for productivity sorry, I've gone back. Let's try again. The domains for productivity may not only be formal, as they were in the table that I showed you a moment or so ago. They may also be semantic. And I'm not going to illustrate this, but if we're thinking about formal domains, the formal domains I gave you were domains determined by the morphology, but we could also have formal domains determined by the stress. So, for instance, the distinction between the suffix "-i's", "-ize", and the suffix "-ifi", it seems to be determined by the stress pattern of the resultant word. Ingo Plug has argued that in great detail. Or the AL that arises in forms like arrival and rebuttal, which demands stress on the final syllable of the base before it will work. So there are lots of different ways of creating these domains. There's not just one, but the story is the same in all of them. And that is that because productivity seems to be different in different domains, then an overall statement of the productivity of an affix is problematic. So if you can't compare affixes which share domains, you can't compare affixes which do not. It's very hard to find affixes which share domains. But overall, comparing affixes in their productivity, given that they differ in the domains, is problematic. The result is that questions like the following are really meaningless. Is ness more productive than ER? Is German ER more productive than English ER? Harold Bayen and Shelley Lieber have answered the first of these questions by using that average over the whole the whole range of the use of the suffixes. The trouble with saying they're meaningless, of course, is that they're actually rather useful questions. It would be nice to have answers for them. I mean, if you're a language teacher teaching German to English speakers or vice versa, should you be telling people in one direction or the other to use that suffix less than they naturally would, given their own background language? It would be quite nice to know, if you're a language teacher teaching English, what are the 5 or the 10 most productive suffixes in English, suffixes and prefixes, because those are the ones which are likely to be most useful for your students. And yet, it seems to me that we really have to conclude that such statements are dubious at the best. So my conclusion here, measuring productivity accurately is not possible for a particular morphological process, particular case of affixation or conversion or some other such process, reduplication. And care needs to be taken in comparing the productivity of synonymous affixes, because actually you're not comparing apples with apples. And I will, though, say that I think it's still okay to characterize the productivity of individual processes as low and high, but it's when we come to specific measures, some of which look spuriously, I think, accurate, that we get into problems. My last question for today is the suffix th, which produces nouns, productive. And like my other questions, this is a specific variant of a more general point. The question is raised from time to time in English with reference to the suffix ment, as in words like accompaniment, the nominal ul, as in cases like arrival, and negative a in words like atelic. But it's perhaps most often raised with reference to nominal th in words like warmth, and that's where I'm going to look at it and where I'm going to discuss it. If we look at what the OED gives us as data on the use of this suffix, we find gloomth from Walpole in 1753. We find greenth from Walpole in 1753. We find blueth from Walpole in 1754. We find bilth from the verb build in 1805. We find ilth from 1862, and we find nothing more recent. In other words, according to the OED data, this suffix really died out in the 18th century. And if we accept Walpole as being some kind of outlier, then probably even earlier than that. What about coolth? People will be saying, coolth, you can invent coolth, that's perfectly productive. The OED has the first mention of coolth is 1547. And the OED says that later uses are recreations of the word, which in some senses was already there in the speech community. We get modern uses of it. J.R.R. Tolkien, the current coolth, which shows signs of losing its facetiousness. I wonder if it has lost its facetiousness. Never mind. And may claim part of the territory of cool. Not quite sure what he means by that, but he thinks it might be losing facetiousness, but clearly he believed that before his period it was facetious. And Elizabeth Peters, hear it we did in the coolth of the evening as twilight spread her violet veils across the garden. Violet veils makes me think this is purple prose. Certainly Elizabeth Peters, who is an author who is not above having playing jokes on her readers, is having fun with language here. This is not entirely a serious use. However, I mean, coolth clearly exists. The question, I suppose, that we have to ask is, do speakers recreate it? And therefore, is it used productively by the individual speakers? Or is it in the environment? Is it in the speech community and is just renewed by people from time to time? And I prefer the latter interpretation, but it is only an interpretation. And it's actually quite hard to prove that suffix is not productive. We can suspect that it's not productive. I suspect that it's not productive, but it's hard to prove. It's not even clear what happens if we get somebody who comes along and acts as a new Walpole and suddenly starts using a whole bunch of th words, new ones, invents bluth again to go with truth. It's not clear that we can ever be sure that something is not productive. You may remember the tale of the suffix dom. In the early 20th century, it was said that this suffix was completely dead, that it was not used at all, that it wasn't productive. Wentworth, in a paper in 1941, showed that dumb had been in productive use for right the way through, that it had never died out. And so there is a salutary tale there with things that we think are dead might turn out not to be. We're on slightly more, on slightly safer grounds when speakers fail to see that there is a pattern involved. So cockerel is, etymologically speaking, at any rate, a diminutive. The ural exists in mackerel. Do you see a link between them? Almost certainly not. And it doesn't seem to be a productive diminutive. Maiden, another diminutive. So maiden means little girl, I suppose. But how many other words can you think of that have en meaning little? Probably not very many. Sparkle, the le is something that makes things happen again and again and again and again. There are quite a lot of words that have this le ending in English, but speakers don't seem to recognize them as being morphological, and they don't seem to use them to create new words. So these look slightly safer as things that are not productive, but basically any pattern has the possibility of being resurrected, so we can't be sure that these things have gone for good. So my conclusion for my final question here is that the borderline between productive and non-productive is as fuzzy as any other borderline. Borderlines are notoriously fuzzy. In principle, it's dangerous to declare something unproductive, even if we don't think it is. Marginal productivity is still productivity and is still important in the way in which the language system is used. So overall, I want to say that the outputs of rules are not unique. They're best bets, but calling them rules is dangerous because of that lack of uniqueness. There's synonymy and homonymy all over the place, despite the supposed push for one form, one meaning. It doesn't seem to push very hard. Any good description has to have a place for tendencies. It has to have a place for the variation. And that variation need not be variation determined by social factors in the Labov sense. It may be variation which we can't pin down to any particular factor causing it. But most importantly, and the takeaway message from all of this, I suppose, is that we must ensure that we don't constrain our theories and our descriptions by asking the wrong questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bauer, for this great talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so now I have some questions from the audience. The first question is from Tamara Bolso, and the question is, two determinants of a pattern's productivity are its type frequency and, to a lesser extent, its token frequency. The former is held to correlate positively with productivity and the latter negatively. What's your view on the role of token frequency in productivity? Do you think that token frequency has a negative effect on productivity as is generally assumed?
If I had a nice answer to this, I would probably have a paper telling you what the nice answer is. I don't have a nice answer. I think the way I would like to look at it is that having greater number of tokens increases the likelihood of you being able to create a new form on the basis of some analogy with those tokens. But having a lot of different forms of low frequency is the result of that process. I hope that answers the question. I think it does.
Okay. Yeah. And a follow-up question.
I'm sorry, I've lost you.
Okay.
I can't hear you, Camilla.
What is your
Sorry, Camila, I think that your connection is not very good right now. Camila?
No?
I'm sorry, Laurie. I think
No,
that yeah, I'm just trying to see if she's coming back. Otherwise, Camila, can you hear us?
probably trying
I'm
to
here.
Ah, good. No, come again.
Hi, Camila. I think it's your connection. Oh, maybe I will read the question, okay? So it's a follow-up to Tamara's question.
Yeah.
Okay. What's your take on meant? It is a very tight frequent suffix, but is only marginally productive, if
Yep.
at all.
Yep.
What is going on?
Huh. I wish I knew. I suspect that we've more or less exhausted the possible set of bases. I can't prove this. Well, I haven't. I probably could if I tried hard enough, but it sounds like hard work. I certainly haven't tried to prove it, but I suspect that most of the verbs which could provide input to it have been used up. And so there are very few possible verbs to add to the collection. That being the case, you'll get very few new forms in meant. And so it looks as if it's unproductive. It may be unproductive solely because there's no input. Obviously, I'm guessing to quite a large extent here, but it's the only way in which I can understand what I observe. Camilla?
Hi, Camila?
Oh, she's gone again.
Are you back? No. Sorry. So there is another question by...
You hear me now?
No, it's your connection, Camila.
Oh, everybody's
So it's another question by Tamara Boso. Do you have any thoughts on how the productivity of a pattern is enhanced by the interaction between type and token frequency?
I thought I answered that in response to the first question. The higher the tokens, provided you've got the input categories, as we've just seen in answer to the second question, then you have the chance for the creation of new forms. The creation of new forms gives rise to a lot of highly productive things, which are in some onomasiological sense useful to us in creating new vocabulary that we need. Then we get a lot of those that have very low frequency. And if we don't have a lot of forms with very low frequency, then we have to assume that the morphological process is not particularly productive. Yeah.
Okay. Just checking if there is any other question, but I think there isn't. Camila, are you back? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, but I couldn't hear you all the time. I'm sorry. So
yeah.
It's just frozen again.
Camila, I think that your connection is not working. No, we cannot hear you.
Sorry.
That's okay. There's just one more question, and I'll finish with that. Okay, Laurie. It's by Manu Quadros, and the question is, in the case of mice, isn't it the case that different speakers have different analysis, thereby saving the idea that at least inflectional rules have a single output for each speaker at least?
Well, I think that the stuff that's being done on Italian and other languages would show that that's not the case. I suspect that there is variation in individual speakers, even in the English cases. Mouse and mice is perhaps these days unusual enough for it. I suppose not with the computer. You get people who talk about computer mouses and computer mice and don't know which to use, and may vary. Then you could push it back and saying, well, aren't these people changing dialects in midstream, and there are two dialects, and we can still save the generalization that there's only one thing for the slot. I think at some point you're just abstracting too far from the data. Yes, I agree, some degree of normalization is required if we're going to get a robust description, but I think you can push that too far, and there are places where you do not get robust descriptions that have just one form in the paradigm.
Okay, thank you very much for this brilliant lecture, Laurie, and I'm sorry about the problem with Camila's network.
Not to worry.
I'm sure that she's very sorry too.
Yes, I'm sure she's feeling embarrassed by that.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you for answering the questions. And do you want to say some final words?
Thank you for inviting me onto your excellent series. I'm pleased to have been here, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you.